Good evening. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, respectfully acknowledges that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including the Dakota land ceded under force in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The History Department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose lands we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So welcome, I'm Sarah Chambers, the chair of the History Department, and it's wonderful to see you this evening. And I want to thank off the top Amanda Nelson from our department, who is managing the logistics of this Zoom behind the scene. The way things are going to work is that we'll start off with a presentation from our guest about her book. There'll be about a half hour of conversation with our other guest, and then questions from you in the audience. So you can be thinking of your questions and putting them in the chat at any point, but when we get to that part of the evening, I will start checking and reading out your questions. It's really an honor today to be discussing the book, The Political Ecology of Violence, Peasants and Pastoralists in the Last Ottoman Century. This was published by Cambridge University Press in their series Studies in Environment and History. And indeed, it's like on the verge of coming out. The printing of it was delayed a bit because the press had, I think, a hacking incident that slowed them down a bit, but we're waiting to get it in our hands any minute, and we've been able to read it in its proof forms. And so I can say that it's really, really an exciting book. Our author guest is Zozan Pehlivan, who joined the department in 2018 and has since held several prestigious fellowships, including the McKnight Land Grant Professorship and a Mellon Foundation Fellow last year at the Newberry Library in Chicago, where she's already started conducting research for a new comparative project. And the research she did for this book was so extensive. Multiple languages, multiple archives, both looking at historical documents, but also at climate data, so very interdisciplinary. She's also developed an exciting set of courses for our department in environmental history at both the graduate and undergraduate levels that have been in high demand among our students. She's going to be in conversation this evening with another colleague, Anna Clark, who has been on the faculty in our department for more than 2 decades, during which time she's held the Samuel Russell Chair in the Humanities. She's a specialist in the history of gender and sexuality, in imperialism, particularly the British Empire, and in human rights, which is one of the intersections that really made her excited to read and engage in conversation about the book this evening. So with that, I will turn things over to Zozan, who has a brief presentation for us about this book.
Oh, okay, unmute. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I would also like to thank to Amanda, our wonderful staff, saving all of our life actually in the history department. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me for this. And thank you, Anna, for being the discussant. I'm looking forward for the questions and the comments. So I'm going to start up my time in order to be in safe side. So my 15 minutes starts. So as Sarah said, this is my first book monograph that is going to be out physically soon. I don't have a copy in my hand, therefore I can't show you. But what I'm going to talk, like making kind of a brief overview of the book that is based on my PhD dissertation that I completed in 2016 at Queen's University in Canada. So the book is a product of almost 15 years of research, painfully reading and evaluating and consistently analyzing and rewriting and deleting and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to do in this book is the book is offering an explanation to one of the most violent historical event in Ottoman Empire, the breakup of the Armenian, or the implementation of Armenian genocide in 1915 by the Ottoman Empire that annihilates Armenians from their homeland in Eastern Anatolia and Central Anatolia and various parts of today's Turkey. What this work does, it doesn't focus on genocide itself, but takes back to the 19th century, late 19th century, and explains the conditions on the ground and the ways in which the physical environment on the ground impacted or contributed to the violence. While doing that, I am making couple of interventions to the historiography of the violence, historiography of the late Ottoman Empire, and intercommunal violence, and in the Middle East particularly. So violence in the Middle East has been tremendously studied, and particularly from ethno-religious lenses, sectarian lenses, or through a kind of violence between agrarian and herding societies, between desert and the sun, that have been used by Gertrude Bell in early 20th century in the context of Syria. So what does the book do is that offering a new theoretical and conceptual framework regarding ethno-religious violence between Kurdish pastoralists and Armenian peasants in late Ottoman Empire by showing how does environmental conditions, particularly climatic anomalies, by climatic anomalies I mean series of extreme drought and severe cold episodes, and how these two phenomena impacted herding and agrarian economy, and in what ways people responded, and how does Ottoman state involved into this process, and how these all factors came together in a period where state expansion is happening, and in a period where imperial competitions between Ottomans, Russians, and the British in Kurdistan kind of conflict with each other, and in what ways the Ottoman central government is making a choice. So that's one of the first kind of finding that I'm making in this book. The second thing is that it's about whether agrarian and herding, which economy is more resilient to climatic changes or environmental disasters. And there I'm engaging the kind of well-established scholar Owen Latimore's assumption that herders are more resilient to climatic changes than peasants. But my findings actually indicate it is in the opposite direction. And these findings are mainly what I interpreted by using climatic anomalies, agronomy, veterinary science, and zoology to interpret what the historical data was telling me. So that is another finding of this book. The third assumption is also kind of the ways in which the Ottoman state centralization attempt and how the Ottomans kind of shifting policies towards peasants and pastoralists in the 19th century in that context. So okay, slides. So the region that I'm working is known as historically Ottoman Kurdistan. This is a region that heavily inhabited by diverse ethno-religious groups: Armenians, Kurds, Turks, Syriacs, Jews, Greeks, Assyrians, Arabic population. It's a very diverse, ethnologically very diverse community. The population of region is in the late 19th century is about 2.5, 3 million, and like about 50% of that population is peasant or agrarian, 40% is pastoral nomadic, and 10% is tent dwellers. And this is a region, it's heavily ecologically and environmentally heavily diverse. There are different forms of ecological landscapes that I called the landscape trilogy of the region. So between south and north, there is a high, like extreme difference between altitude. The north is about 3,000 meters above the sea level. The south is kind of about 600 meters. So there is a very diverse in terms of the elevation. And between the mountains, there are extremely fertile agricultural plains, but also pastures. So the region is heavily inhabited by agropastoral peasantry, but also peasants. And the connecting thread of these diverse ecology is the mobility of peasants and the mobility of pastoralists and their millions of herd animals that, according to my estimations, in mid-19th century, while the region's population was about 2.5, 3 million, there were about 12 million animals, and these are mainly sheep, goats, and cattle. And as I said,
Excuse me, Zozan, I just want to, did you want to share your slides at this point, or
sorry?
did you want to share your slides at this point?
Oh, they are the
We're not
slides are
seeing the
not.
slides, no.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. Oh, I thought I shared already. Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, here. I'm so sorry. Okay. And the slides are there. Okay, so this is the region. I will just briefly go the Ottoman Kurdistan, and this is the landscape trilogy that I was talking about: mountains, pastures, plains, and this is the migration routes of pastoralists and how pastoralists as a connecting thread, and the millions of animals linking pasture lands and mountains together, as well as the agricultural lands to the cities, and so on and so forth. So and as you see, animal husbandry that you see in this slide, the region was well connected all around the Ottoman Empire, particularly Egypt, Syria, and Istanbul, by exporting about 500,000 animals. And the economic value of these animals is about, according to British sources, is about 300,000 pounds in 1860s. And the economic value of that money is actually, I was counting the other day, is about 30 million pounds in today's value. That means that whole money was actually coming to pastoralist hands, and as well as the what's called investors, or the kind of the businessmen, mainly who are Armenians, having a connecting thread with pastoralists, or doing co-businesses with pastoralists. So in late 19th century, from 1840s onward, however, series of climatic anomalies begin in the region. And as my work has shown, is that there is these climatic anomalies were part of global El Nino patterns. The pattern starts in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman Kurdistan specifically in 1840s, but the threshold of these severe climatic anomalies in the region is 79 and 1880. And that particular year starts with extreme drought, followed by an extreme cold. And during that time, peasants and pastoralists both experienced tremendous loss. A huge amount of harvest failed, famine, starvation, inflation, high food prices. About 10,000 people lost their life. But millions of animals perished, particularly in the severe cold episode of 1880. So what does that mean? So as an environmental historian, you have to ask, what does that mean? So what does, like, when these harvest failed when these animals die. So, and that is related how agrarian and herding economies are doing the investment. That's one particular thing. But before that, I would like to make a clarification that when agricultural harvest fails, usually it takes about 2 growing seasons for an agrarian economy to recover. Like if you are a peasant household and your harvest failed, it takes about 2 harvest seasons for you to recover your loss. At least you won't starve to death. For a herding economy, if you have thousands, like let's say you have 1,000 heads of sheep and goats, and 70% of that population died, and you left with 30%, it takes about 8 to 10 years for you to recover your loss. So on the one hand, you have 2 years. On the other hand, there between 8 to 10 years recovery period in post-crisis period. And as you see in these time scales in this chart, is that the crises are consistently repeating. That means that the timetable of recovery for both pastoralists and peasants is going to extend, but particularly for pastoralists, it's going to even be longer. And that's what I call ecological disequilibrium between agrarian and herding economies. And furthermore, the ecological disequilibrium is not only ecological, but economic, because these two different groups are making their investments in different sectors of the economy. Pastoralists are doing their investments. It is the animals are not only their source of food, but also their source of wealth, their source of political power, their source of social power and prestige. On the other hand, peasants have harvest like agricultural crops, but also peasants are being favored historically by Ottoman state because of the tax reasons, because of conscriptions, because of public order, and so on and so forth. So in other words, state consistently supplying peasants with various forms of aid and relief, either by giving them tax relief, by distributing seeds, by giving them loans, agricultural loans, particularly in mid-19th century, with very low rate of interest, postponing their taxes, and so on and so forth. Besides state, you have missionaries, you have British consuls, French consuls, Russian consuls that are providing relief to peasants, as well as you have Armenian relief committees and some other relief committees. So in other words, when these crises are continuing to happen, the recovery, the timetable of recovery extend even more because of these, the chart that you see, one group is consistently receiving support, the other one does not. So the ecological disequilibrium, it makes kind of not only ecological, but also economic, as I said, because of their investments. And so what happens is that in order to not wait 8 to 10 years to recover their 70% of their loss, pastoralists begin to implement a form of recovery. And they start to steal animals from other peasants or from their neighboring pastoralists. So animal theft became an epidemic in the late 19th century Ottoman Kurdistan. And in this chart that you see, this is mainly, actually it's all from Ottoman archives that I created a data set to identify these patterns of animal rustling in the late 19th century. And that is about 250 cases here that covers about 25 years of late 19th, early 20th century. And what I do, identify animal theft as a form of slow violence. And there I kind of take from Rob Nixon's terminology of slow violence, but reinterpret in a way that brings the livelihoods in the center of the story, and there is like animal theft became a part of slow violence, and then kind of not only animal theft, sometimes pastoralists would bring their herd animals to feed on the peasants' farmlands, and so on and so forth. So the slow violence was the result of accumulative strategies of survival in the late 19th century Ottoman context. And what is the state, besides providing relief to peasants, what does state do in late 19th century? As I said, and this is the mapping of the slow violence in the region. So what does state do in the late 19th century? Abdulhamid II has extreme amount of anxiety that the British Empire is going to set up an Armenian and sorry, I will take 2 more minutes, an Armenian state in the heart of the Eastern Anatolia or Kurdistan. And that anxiety and stress and the Russian pressure, because after the Berlin Congress, both Russians and the British consistently demanding Ottomans to do reforms in these areas of the region. What Abdulhamid II eventually decides is that, seeing that the British, after the British annexation of Cyprus, he makes a kind of clear-cut choice and shifts his state support towards the pastoralists. And in 1891, the Ottomans decides to recruit pastoralists who had extreme loss of their form of subsistence during the crisis. The states invite them and recruit them as a paramilitary force, and giving them uniforms, giving them salary, and also protection, because in order to take any pastoralist group that kind of involve into violence against peasants or other pastoralist groups, they should have the government, local government has to have permission from Zeki Pasha here in on the upper left photo that you see in the middle. He's the kind of mastermind of these paramilitary forces that Ottomans actually inspired from Russian experience in the 19th century, that Russians recruited Kazakhs to do paramilitary forces, to turn them into paramilitary forces, and the Ottomans does the same thing. And of course, after the Hamidiyeh, like after these desperate pastoral groups that you see here became in uniform, salaried, and they use their forms of knowledge and political experience and mobility and arms and protection, of course, against all other segments of population. And this situation would eventually lead one of the biggest anti-Armenian pogroms in Sassoon in 1894. What this work does, I will wrap it up, is actually offering, we cannot understand anti-Armenian pogroms in 1890s without understanding 1880s in Ottoman Kurdistan, that it was covered with epidemic of animal rustling, usurpation of pasture lands, attacks against villages, attacks against granaries, and so on and so forth. And therefore, to understand the violence, intercommunal violence in the late Ottoman Empire, we have to go beyond sectarian lenses. We have to go beyond the ethno-religious lines and to have a more nuanced understanding of slow violence and how actually an incident of animal theft could be a kind of a bullet that triggers the entire series of violence in a region that is experiencing this series of crises. Thank you for your time. I will stop here. And I'm consistently using this image because I paid $400 to get permission for this photographer of Obama. So it's a church in Eastern Turkey, in southeastern Turkey. And thank you.
Well, that's just wonderful. This has been such a pleasure to read Zozan's book and to be in dialogue with her about this history, which has really changed the way I view a lot of things. And reading it, it was especially fascinating, the incredible detail and breadth of knowledge that Zozan that you came about with the human animal and the climate human interactions, drawing on botany and climate data and a lot of incredible specifics about kinds of sheep. But what kind of difficulties did you face and excitements did you face doing this kind of environmental human animal history? And would you recommend it to others to take up this?
This is a complex and multi-layered question. Would I recommend any others? If they have time, yes, why not? Because first of all, I think it took a while for me to understand the structure of environmental history and how much it requires interdisciplinary methodologies. So to understand what was drought mean for animal population, I really need to understand the physiology of animals. Therefore, I dedicated 6 months of my life to understand physiology of sheep and goats in the region. How long they can survive without food, how long they can survive without water, how much snow they can dig and catch the food, in what temperature they are not able to survive, in what conditions they became vulnerable or susceptible to diseases, in what conditions they provide more miscarriages. So this type of, I think, information that I kind of dedicated about 6 months to understand that physiology of animals. That was kind of the first thing. Second is also botany and agronomy, to kind of in what conditions like these staple crops like wheat, barley, millet, and other crops are surviving, and how much the temperature has to go, or how much drought should happen for a tree when its roots are completely being dried up, and so on and so forth. So that was kind of a way of, it kind of enlightened me to read, to interpret archival documents, what I was reading. So I think that was very enlightening moment, that the moment that I figured out that this physiology was much important, like much easier to say, like to interpret the historical documents. And also kind of the other question is about climate data. So the chart that you saw is almost like a product of 3-4 years documentation. I have an Excel sheet, would put the years, and then when kind of the Excel sheet every year would have a color, and then when I saw the pattern, that was the moment as, oh, these are the years with Mike Davis's data is fitting to that. So that was kind of thing. The challenge, yes, it is challenging, but it's also, I think, satisfactory in many ways to kind of understand the complexity of everyday life, the complexity of intercommunal violence, I think, and the complexity of like how people interact with each other, what brings them into kind of clashes. I think that was a moment for me to see that. Yeah.
That's great. That brings me to my next question. And the clashes. When I teach human rights, I usually teach a class on the Armenian genocide. I'm no expert, but your work really promises to give a new interpretation of that. And we usually understand the Armenian genocide, as you say, with about sectarian violence, and also the context of World War II and the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the Young Turks, who wanted to create a pure Turkish society and attacked the Armenians. But you show that it really, the kind of backstory was the clashes between these people who had been neighbors, the Kurdish pastoralists, and then the Armenian peasants and merchants and city dwellers, which is, and how the climate change and the vacillating policy of the Ottomans favoring one and then the other. And you can really see how this violence can erupt in a whole new ways. But maybe you could say a little bit more about your interpretation of the genocide. And also it's very controversial because the Turkish government really does not want it to be termed a genocide. And there's been a lot of pushback on scholars who do assert that, especially Turkish scholars. And have you experienced that kind of pushback? Do you want to say more about that?
I personally did not experience specifically using genocide. But recently, just actually a few weeks ago, a Turkish a radio station in Istanbul that was doing a lot of environmental stuff was shut down. A 30-year-old radio station was shut down because one of the guests was saying Armenian genocide, and the radio station's license was canceled by the Turkish Radio and TV Supreme Council on the ground that it's fueling the conflict in the country because of the term, the Armenian genocide. Yes, it is the term is in many ways it is by this it has been rejected by the Turkish state and that this was the war conditions. We didn't commit, the Ottoman state did not commit the genocide, the Armenian genocide. This was the war conditions. I personally did not experience in the archive, in the Ottoman archive, because this is a kind of way of doing archives in any state archive, but you are choosing your words. You are your terminology somehow speaks what you are doing, because in Turkish, in the Ottoman archives, you are entering all your ID numbers to do any types of search. You have to enter your national ID card, like social security number, in order to be able to do search. And like animals, I go with animals, I go with place names, I go with droughts, severe cold, and so on and so forth. But I think that what this work has have a couple of pushbacks, or could be attacks, or in censorship in many ways. My work is not because of both. So Armenian genocide is one part, is coming from state, but also the self-surveillance of the liberal academy in Turkey is that because they're afraid from this kind of the political pressure and so on and so forth, they started to go to censor certain words like Ottoman Kurdistan. I was invited to give a talk in Turkish Social History Foundation 2 years ago about environmental history, and I sent a title, and I was asked to change that title with Turkey or Ottoman Empire, and when I said I'm not going to, the talk was canceled. So that is the level of kind of pushbacks, unfortunately, that academics developed to protect themselves, or kind of is kind of saving their positions and so on and so forth. So it is the sword for this work that we just heard is not only about Armenian genocide, is also using Kurdistan as a geographic space that is historically Ottomans were identifying as Kurdistan, as it is in the Ottoman archive from 16th century onward, that you see Kurdistan is a geography in the Ottoman archive, but that is kind of the double sword, kind of double-edged sword that this work is having. So I have, in both ways, I guess.
That's fascinating. That's an added layer of complexity on it. And then my last question is, as you say, there has been attention in the Middle East to the nomadic problems and the environmental problems that contribute to the many other factors for violence in the Middle East and elsewhere. And can you say a bit about how your work can help us understand what's going on today in terms of environmental stresses causing migration, refugee crises, internecine violence, and so on?
Yeah, sure. So in Turkey, there is a very like limited number of nomads left, and mainly and in eastern part of Turkey, because of the various policies, nomadic population consistently declines because most of them are not able to access their historical pasture lands or grazing zones. In other parts of Middle East that we see, for example, the other day there was a news that I saw in Palestine under the assault of Israeli state, that nomads have been losing enormous amount of their pasture lands and are kind of losing their mode of subsistence. So that in addition to millions of people in Gaza are victims of this violence, but also the pastoralists as well as a form of subsistence in that particular geography. Similarly, in Yemen, that we consistently are seeing the remaining Yemenis, like pastoral nomads in Yemen, are losing their pasture lands as the Saudi state consistently bombing their historical pasture lands. And in other parts of the Middle East and East Africa, like in Kenya, there are like a consistent news that we are reading in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as East Africa, that peasants and pastoralists are fighting for available grazing lands, because this is, if you can't feed your animals, you are going to lose a lot. And having an animal, like depending on animal, it's not only as a source of food, but also your wealth. You rely on that animals. The disappearance of that animals is very critical. In that regard, I think this work can help us to see the dimension of climatic anomalies in today's world, and how these climatic anomalies are impacting different ecological zones across the world. And just last year in March in Mongolia, like a severe zoot episode destroyed millions of animals in Mongolia. And what will happen eventually? Those herders, Mongolian herders, are going to be proletariat in the urban space after losing their form of subsistence and livelihood. I think it really speaks to kind of to understand like what might happen in the future, and or what is happening in the present, to kind of to predict the potential scenario in different parts of the world. Yeah.
Fascinating. I think we'll open it up to the chat. Sarah, are you going to moderate the next part?
Yes, so feel free to put questions in the chat and I will read them out to our guests. And maybe while we're waiting for that, I would invite Zozan to tell us a little bit about your current research, since I know it was sort of inspired by what you found in the case of Ottoman Kurdistan, but now you're broadening it out in a really globally comparative way.
Sure. So for my next project, what I would like to do, or I'm working on, I don't know how many years will take, but I'm working on a comparative project that does the ways in which American, Ottoman, and British Empire sedentarized or forcefully resettled their mobile populations in the context of British Punjab or Western India and today's Pakistan. Even you can a bit go up until Afghanistan's border, as well as the Great Plains in the United States and Ottoman Kurdistan. What I notice is that there is a kind of late 19th century or mid-19th, from 1850s onward, I would say, there is a pattern of states expansion in these grassland ecologies that across the world. And Ottoman Empire were never seen as part of this expansion because it was the sick man of the Europe. It was an empire that is losing power, losing territories consistently, having Russian warfare, like having wars with Russia, consistently losing those wars with Russia, and losing territories like Egypt. Cyprus and many others. So it is the sick man of Europe that is trying to survive. But when you look at the conditions on the ground, when you look at the ways in which Ottomans are implementing strategies to forcefully sedentarize these people, they are using the same jargon, they are using the same methods, same strategies like militarization of landscape, militarization of pastoralists or herders, building new villages, building roads, building telegraph lines, trying to establish army base. So these are the state-wise policies, but also 19th century is also a time period that these climatic anomalies are global at the same time. So in what ways these anomalies have been instrumentalized, in what levels? Because like the idea is like absolutely these different geographic regions of the world experience these climatic anomalies in different ways. And the state's expansion is also different ways, but how that these empires succeeded about these policies, I think that is the question needs to be examined, and it is important to bring the Ottomans into this picture because like the whole policy that this is an empire that's trying to survive, but actually no, it is on the ground, it's working very strongly. And in what ways we can understand these policies and strategies, and what can it tell us about state formation, or whether the Ottomans are colonial state or not, because there is a huge debate in the field whether we can call Ottomans colonial or not, or is it traditional empire, is colonial, what makes an empire colonial or not. So yeah.
Yeah, well, we won't expect you to come out with that book anytime soon, given that the kind of research methods that you now are already so intensive, and you have to expand it to these additional cases. But when it does come out, we'll be excited to talk about it. But going back to the book that is on the verge of being printed, Susanna Smith has a question. She says, Zozan, I'm so excited about your work and so happy that you've published it. It's tremendously interesting. Given what you have already said, I wonder whether there would be an opportunity to publish your book in Turkish, and if so, you would want to do so. And then added also kind of wondering whether you imagined yourself becoming an environmental historian when you started this project.
No, I was not an environmental historian when I started this project. I was an economic historian. I have been trained as an economic historian, and that's why perhaps there is a lot of economy in the book. My training is, I have been trained as an economic historian of early modern era. And when I started in the archive, I started I was looking for nomadic economy in the like Ottoman, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. But the files when I was taking, it was all about different stories. It was about drought, it was about famine, and like crisis, animal loss, petitioning, and so on and so forth, and droughts. So I eventually kind of, at the end of the 9th month in the British archives, I kind of had a different subject. And that was the product. And then eventually I ended up in the Ottoman archive, spent about 3 years in the Ottoman archive, because the Ottoman archive structure is very different from British archive. Every document is, the conversation goes, and the little detail would come at the end of the document. So it takes much longer time. So I wasn't an environmental historian before I became an environmental historian, in the ways that I was engaging with the archive. That was the thing. Regarding Turkish publication, yes, I do want to publish in Turkish, absolutely. It's and also not only Turkish, I would like to the book being published in Kurdish as well, because this is a story of Kurds as well. And I'm in conversation with a Turkish publication house. They have an interest. I haven't heard final words from them, so I won't name them here. But let's wait in a few more weeks, hopefully.
Yes, we'll hope that works out. Erin has put a question in the chat. Hi, Zozan. Congratulations again on the book. My question is about methodology. Did you ever encounter tension between what broad environmental data or structures showed and what more cultural or political sources indicated about a place or time or event? And if so, what did you do?
That is a very fascinating question, Erin. So I want to note it because I think it might help me for the second book project. So I think the environmental it depends on how you actually mingle these different sources. It depends on how you approach them. So the political data, political story, you see it. But what environmental data is actually tells you, is you are looking on the conditions and you are seeing how the state actually is playing on the ground. In like how the state engage. Like for example, there is a severe drought or famine in one city, and the Ottoman government eventually says, the local government says, okay, we have to cancel the export of the food from this province. And they eventually inform the central government, and the central government will agree or not. The Ottoman, let's say there is a famine, peasants are petitioning the governors and saying that, can you please cancel the taxes for this? And the local government sends to the center and asking the Ministry of Finance permission. And the Ministry of Finance comes and gives a suggestion saying, okay, not canceling, you are collecting taxes, but on the ground that in the taxation practices there are hierarchies, you collect taxes from this and you postpone taxes from this for next year. So you see these ways, and actually that's what in the book I called hierarchy of concern in the Ottoman relief measures, and how the state actually has a hierarchical order and mindset while distributing the relief. So, and I think, yes, like the political tension, like you see, the state is actually trying to impose its hegemony on the province, but state also relying those sources and managing and distributing these sources. And this is a craftsman of Ottoman historical Ottoman provisionism. It is a strategy that has been implemented from the beginning of the empire, that Ottoman Empire is very good in managing of its political ecology. So it will bring sources from different areas, or like either food or raw materials in the areas that are abundant to the areas that are scarcity, and putting a NAR system, like kind of a price policy to be offered to the market. So I think you like I don't know whether I understood correctly the tension point, but I do see kind of the way that environmental crisis was happening, and the way that the politics is trying to manage that. If do I understand correctly, Erin? Do I respond?
Let me see if I can unmute. I don't know, Erin, if I can unmute you or not in the way
It's okay, he says.
Oh, okay, great. But at the end, we will unmute and we can chat a bit more if we need to. You know, as I hear you talking, Zozan, too, you know, particularly thinking about the origins of this project and how it is developed, and I think many of us as historians know, like we go into the archive with one set of questions, and then it's like the sources are kind of talking back to us and saying, you need to pay attention to this other thing. But this is also a landscape that you know really well. And I thought one of the really beautiful things in the book, there is a lot of economy and there's a lot of detail about animals, and it's all interesting, but you also do a really beautiful job of evoking what life was like in these places and what these communities were like. And even though the end point of your analysis is about violence,
Mhm.
you also show the kind of neighborliness and coexistence that was possible when there weren't these environmental crises that were then also um, exaggerated by the policies of the state. So I don't know if that's more of a comment than a question, but
No, I think it is providing that was like as somebody who grew up in that geography, I think it was important for me to make it visible in people's mind. And I think that was also, I had a political mission to complete there, that this region was not always in the lenses of sectarian violence. Like, and if you look at people's everyday life, here are these village lives, and this is how they communicate with each other. This is how they interact with each other. And I think that was kind of an important mission, that to bring that up forward, to make it clear in people who never been in that region, who never had that experience. So I think it was a personal ethnography somehow became clear in that part. Yeah.
Well, I think you succeeded very well in that mission that you had. So now Ajay has put something into the chat. Thank you, Zozan, for your wonderful presentation and congratulations on this fantastic book. What you have accomplished in the book, connecting environmental and political and social history in a beautiful way, is amazing. The question I have is more of a cultural history one, but you have very likely reflected on it and perhaps even written on it. As the multicultural society that existed formally unravels, how do the images and representations that the various communities have of themselves and each other change?
Oh, Ajay, that is it's a very intriguing question. And actually, the section that Sarah just explained about my personal ethnography is that there is a phrase in Kurdish, in my mother tongue, in Zazaki actually, is that to identify the quality of a fabric, you will say it is being produced by an Armenian waiver, okay? But at the same way, you will, in order to criticize the quality of that fabric, that it's very loose and it will go, you will do the same language. You will say, oh, he like did like an Armenian waiver in a very loose way, didn't care, and so on and so forth. So this, and that is a very interesting phrase when I notice kind of the same way you are, in order to say how high quality fabric this is, it has been produced by an Armenian waver. And to criticize the low quality, you also kind of making that suggestion. And I think these form of kind of double ways of identification is tells us how they are very well connected with each other, and that I think that is really interesting to see, in like both to criticize, both to glorify in the same thing. And another thing I think is these images of representation is kind of if you are looking to material culture, you can see more of those representations, like the way food has been described, the way the, let's say, the water canals in the village life has been described or instrumentalized, the way that you talk about craftsmanship of the wood. These are all, like, if you more look at the language and the way that people talk about their materials, and how that materiality has been associated with certain segments of population, certain communities, I think it tells us something. And it's, of course, it's changing. And like, as the image that the church image is coming from Khanchepek, it is the oldest neighborhood in Diyarbakir, heavily inhabited by Christian Armenians and Syriacs and Assyrians. And it is also known as Gavur Mahallesi, the district of infidel. It's kind of really how these people, like, they are using insulting words to each other, but they at the same time they are sitting and drinking coffee together, or cooking the same dessert. It's really interesting. I think it is a world that we kind of have never grasped in our everyday life. Maybe that is why. Yeah.
Thank you. We also have a question from an alum, Tyler. Hi, Zozan. Thank you for sharing your research. I'm wondering if the animal theft you described was being committed by any specific group. Thinking about this in relation to the later genocide, I'm wondering whether we should think of the theft solely as further harming pastoralist livelihoods, or did it also lead to animosity towards a specific group?
Absolutely. So the data set that you saw is that actually in the beginning, what the data I have kind of used, the first couple of years, let's say in early 1880s, the main events or attacks is like, first of all, the number of animals are very small, like a couple of heads, 2, 3, 1. Then the numbers increase. That's the first thing. Like, becomes 20, becomes 50, and in some cases it's become 100. And if the animals are, the identity of animals are, if they are draft animals, like horse, like cattle, like mule or oxen, that are specified. The state records, the Ottoman state records, making sure that the identity or the character of these animals have been specified because they are extremely valuable. And what is very interesting, that the data set that you saw, is that in the beginning, pastoralists, peasants stealing from each other. This is not only for peasants or for pastoralists, but peasants as well. Peasants also involved in the animal rustling. What happens in 1894 in Sassoon is that, according to sources that we have, the pastoralists are attacking, like stealing some Armenian cattle in Sassoon district. The Armenians pursue them back and they take their animals back. And the Kurdish pastoralists go to the local government and say the Armenians are in rebellion. And that is the moment that Ottoman army is employing soldiers and attacking. So the animosity shifts at that particular moment and become kind of ethno-religious in that regard. So the theft issue is when the data also shows, and I explain in the book, in 1890s, after the formation of Hamidian light cavalry, the number of incidents involved with violence and an entire attack to village life becomes common. Before that, the violence was only stealing animals, stealing property, but not was involving killing or raping or burning the village or stealing the entire village property. After the Hamidiyya, somehow the regiments gave a kind of protection, and I think like it's very clear that the state uniform and arms gave them a protection. It's just like kind of it became a state-sponsored violence, state-sponsored collective violence to that. And some groups and in 1890s massacres, though they were part of Hamidiyya, they protected Armenians, like Milli Ibrahim Pasha in Urfa. he invited Armenians from Diyarbakir who were running away from the violence in Diyarbakir to Viranshehir and welcomed them in his territory. So the side of the story is, as I said, I'm saying in the books, is kind of not only consistently violence. There are many groups that actually protected the Armenians in the area during these pogroms in 1890s.
Well, thank you so much, Zozan, for sharing this great book with us, and we can't wait to actually have it in a physical form. And thank you, Anna, for coming and posing such fascinating questions, and of course to everyone in the audience for your questions and your attendance here this evening. This is the last book club for this semester. We'll start off the spring semester book club on February 12th for a timely conversation on new directions in immigration history with the current and immediate past directors of the Immigration History Research Center and holders of the Rudolph Vicoli Chair in Immigration History. So Lana Barber, who has just joined the department this year, and Erica Lee, who was previously at our department and is now at Harvard. So Amanda has put up a registration link if you want to go ahead and get that on your calendar. And then, as always, if you're so inclined, we put in a link in case you would like to make a gift to the history department. Particularly, we channel these towards our graduate student fellowships, which support the work that will become books in the future. And so with that, we'll draw the official book club for this month to a close. But I do invite you, if you want to stay, we'll turn off the recording and open up the mics if you just want to greet Zozan and Anna.